Hi again, everyone. We are just now at 7 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that there'll still be some people coming in as we start talking, but there's a lot of ground to cover tonight, as you're going to learn very soon. And somehow these events never seem quite long enough. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley. I'm our Vice President of Democracy Initiatives and Author Talks here for the History Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight and to welcome our featured author, Adam Brookes. His new book is just out a couple of weeks ago. It's called Fragile Cargo, the World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City. It is fascinating. It's art history, it's military history, it's cultural history, and you can get it for 25% off tonight only at Atlanta History Center's online bookstore. That helps support the programming we do here and, of course, supports Adam as he continues his book tour. Tonight, Adam will be presenting some slides to you. There's some wonderful photographs. I'm really excited for you to see them. After he concludes his remarks, there will be time for your questions. You can submit those using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we hope that you will submit your questions, that you'll purchase the book, and that you really enjoy your time here tonight with Atlanta History Center. It's my pleasure to welcome Adam Brookes. He was born in Canada, grew up in the United Kingdom, a journalist for BBC News, a correspondent in Beijing, as well as Indonesia and the United States. He is currently in Tacoma Park, Maryland, but joining us virtually here in Atlanta tonight. Adam, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Claire, for having me. This story that we're going to talk about now, it's primarily a story about people. It's about people who committed to saving art in wartime. It's a story about China. It's a story, I hope, also about China's Second World War, this extraordinary concatenation of events that have been largely forgotten in Europe and the United States. And the place we're going to start is here. This is the Meridian Gate. It's the southern entrance to the Forbidden City. In the center of the Chinese capital, what today we call Beijing, but I'm going to call Peking for a lot of this evening. In the center of Beijing, Peking, there is the Imperial City. And in the center of the Imperial City, you've seen images of it, those great red walls and those yellow tiled roofs. In the center of the Imperial City lies the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City was where, after the 1400s, the emperors of the Ming Empire and the Qing Empire lived. Only they and their courts and their households could live and move freely. What you're looking at here is the southern entrance to the Forbidden City. It's called the Meridian Gate. This photograph was taken in about 1900, and look at the state of it. Stuff is falling off, stones are falling down, the roofs are falling apart. Look at the weeds in the courtyard. We're in the closing moments of empire in China, the closing moments of 2,000 years of monarchy. Behind those gates is where the emperors lived over 6 centuries, but also behind those gates, inside the Forbidden City, among all its palaces and courtyards and alleyways, is an absolutely colossal collection of art, absolutely vast. There are paintings, there's porcelain, jades, bronzes, thrones, clocks, tapestries, jewels, books, encyclopedias, archives, massive variety. And these collections of art that lived in the Forbidden City played many different roles. Some of them were decorative, some had ritual roles. Much of the art was sort of functional. It wasn't art at all. Porcelain was there to be eaten off or used in rituals. And the imperial collections themselves, the art that lived in the Forbidden City, was deeply intertwined with the mystique of the emperor and the imperial system. And what's very important to understand was these art collections in the Forbidden City were hidden. They were secret. The ordinary people of China never got to see them. Fast forward to 1911. The last days of the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire falls and 2,000 years of monarchy fall with it. 1912, the Republic of China is founded, a very weak state with weak central politics. China is dominated mostly by warlords and regional strongmen. This isn't the People's Republic of China. It's not communist China. This is the Republic of China. The last emperor of China, Puyi, is allowed to stay on inside the Forbidden City, even though he's no longer a functioning emperor. And at this time, much of the art inside is getting stolen, it's getting pilfered, and is making its way out to the art dealers in the markets of Peking. Fast forward again now to 1924. The last emperor, Puyi, is still in there. He's still in these palaces. But in November 1924, troops of a warlord, a regional strongman named Feng Yuxiang, burst in and they order the last emperor to leave. He's got to get out, which he does. And now the Forbidden City is empty, silent, echoing, dark palaces, no emperor, no empire, just these vast art collections sitting in these silent, empty palaces. Rumors spread around Peking that the warlord, Feng Yuxiang, is going to pack up the imperial collections and cart them off on camel trains and sell them off to foreigners. In fact, he doesn't do anything of the sort. He does the opposite. He appoints something called the Qingshi Shanhou Weiyuan Hui, the Committee for the Disposition of the Qing Household. And this committee takes charge of the Forbidden City and all the imperial palaces. And this committee of 15 people decides that their first task is to decide what's exactly in there, what's in these palaces, what art is there. And in December 1924, teams go into the freezing, dark, silent halls and palaces of the Forbidden City, and they begin the huge task of cataloging everything that's inside. This is one of the few images we have of that process. Here are people in the early mid-1920s going through archives in the Forbidden City, trying to sort out these mounds of documents and books and texts and rare archives and all sorts of material, trying to get a handle on what was in there. Who were the people who went in on these inventory teams? They were professors and students mainly from Peking University, China's first modern university, founded in 1898. These were people who understood what they were seeing, and very importantly, they could be trusted not to steal what they found. Most importantly for our story is this guy. His name is Ma Heng. He was born in 1881, just outside Shanghai. He was an excellent student as a child. He studied ancient inscriptions. He was immersed in classical Chinese learning, in the cutting of seals and calligraphy, all the sort of things that a traditional Chinese scholar in a Confucian environment would learn. But in 1902, he marries into a very, very wealthy family in Shanghai. And he becomes a businessman. And for 15 years, he lives in Shanghai, working as a businessman, working in banks and hardware stores and factories, all these enterprises owned by his very wealthy family. But all that time, he carries on his scholarship as well. He carries on his study of traditional Chinese antiquarian culture, art, inscriptions, seals, texts. And he carries on collecting as well at the same time. He's a collector of art himself. He's a rather retiring, reticent character, rather quiet. And he's always wanted to be a true scholar. And in 1917, he decides to change his life. And he moves to Peking and he takes up a position at Peking University and he becomes a true scholar at the age of 36. And in 1924, he is among the inventory teams. He's on one of the inventory teams that go into the Forbidden City and begin this massive process of cataloging all the art inside it. The catalog that they assemble runs to 1.17 million objects. What sort of things were they finding in those dark, empty palaces? They were finding paintings like this one. This is called Early Snow on the River. It's a long hand scroll that you roll out from right to left. This is just a detail from it. It was painted just over 1,000 years ago in the southern Tang Kingdom by a painter named Zhao Gan. It's ink on silk, all painted with brush and ink and a little pigment. And it's a depiction, incredibly loving depiction of the lives of fishermen on a river in China in the 10th century. It's very, very beautiful. And the mastery and control of the brush and the ink that this painter had is absolutely extreme. It's a wonderful masterpiece of Chinese art. This is one of the paintings they found in the Forbidden City at the time. They found paintings like this one, a nature study. No people, no figures in this at all. This is all nature. A study of deer in an autumn grove, painted around the same time, about 1,000 years ago. This was painted in something called the Liao Empire that occupies part of southern Russia, Mongolia, and China today. Absolutely extraordinary, closely observed depiction of the anatomy and movement of deer. They found porcelain, mountains of porcelain, incredibly rare porcelain like this, a ewer from the Ming Empire from the 15th century. And what's so special about this little ewer, this little jug with a lid, is not the porcelain itself, it's the glaze. This is a vanishingly rare copper red glaze, incredibly difficult to achieve. And they only made it for about 20 years in the 15th century. And as time went on, these inventory teams, as they worked their way through the palaces and they catalogued 1 million pieces of art, much that had never been seen before, they came to understand that they were not just cataloguing art objects. They were starting to understand this huge, vast artistic and intellectual inheritance that had never really been seen before in China. Here's Ma Heng again, painted, drawn by a good friend of his, the very famous Chinese artist Xu Beihong. By the late 1920s, Ma Heng is in his 40s, he's a successful scholar, and he holds a post at Peking University, but he's also been instrumental in turning the Forbidden City and this vast collection of art into a museum, the Palace Museum. Founded in 1925, it's still there today in central Beijing, one of the central cultural institutions of China. Ma Heng was central in establishing this museum. And as the museum's established, all the objects inside it have changed. They've gone from being the private, secret hoard of emperors, and they've become national objects owned by the state, the property of the Republic of China, a young, modernizing nation state. And the role of this art is to educate the public in Chinese history, but also, I think, to generate a sense of national identity and shared national history among the citizens of the new, young, fragile Republic of China. And then the story completely changes. 1931, Japan invades northeastern China and swallows up what was called at the time, what we refer to today as Manchuria, the far northeastern 3 provinces of China. 1932, Japan launches a big military operation in Shanghai. Here's an image of Chinese troops defending Shanghai in 1932 against Japanese landings, Japanese invasion. Japan bombs Shanghai in 1932. It's the first time that a civilian population has been subjected to protracted aerial terror bombing by aircraft. And crucially at this point, the Japanese bomb in Shanghai a building called the Commercial Press, and attached to it the Oriental Library, and they destroy an enormous collection of paintings and manuscripts. And people realize suddenly that this new terrifying thing, the air raid, aerial bombing, being bombed by bombers from above, doesn't just destroy cities and kill people, it destroys culture, it eviscerates culture. 1933, the Japanese are on the move again. They're moving down from the north. They're approaching Peking from the north. They're right at the Great Wall. Japanese troops and tanks are about 4 hours from Peking. At some point in 1932, it's difficult to point out exactly when, to nail down exactly when, the decision is taken in the Palace Museum inside the Forbidden City that if the imperial art collections are to be kept safe from air raid and from Japanese troops and from plunder, they are going to have to be evacuated from Peking. So the curators, Ma Heng among them, begin to select the most valuable, irreplaceable pieces in the imperial collections, and they begin to pack them. And they pack them using cotton wadding and paper and rice husks and hemp cord in wooden cases like this. This is one of the very few images we have of the packing process. And altogether, the Forbidden City and a few other museums across Peking pack 20,000 wooden cases full of absolutely irreplaceable art. As a sort of shorthand number, you can think about perhaps 250,000 objects and texts being packed in those cases. 28,000 pieces of porcelain, 8,000 paintings, 8,000 works in jade, entire encyclopedias, thrones, clocks, inscriptions, bronzes, vast amounts of material packed into these 20,000 wooden cases. Early 1933, the order is given for evacuation. The Japanese are only hours away. Japanese planes are flying overhead. Here you see the cases in the courtyards of the Forbidden City being readied for evacuation. To start with, these 20,000 wooden cases are taken by train out of Shanghai in a highly disorganized and troubled effort to Shanghai. Strange decision, given that Shanghai was just attacked by the Japanese and bombed by the Japanese. But it's believed by the Palace Museum and its directors that they will be safe in Shanghai as long as they stay in what are called the foreign concessions. Those are bits of Shanghai that were controlled mainly by the British and the French. They were sort of extraterritorial enclaves in Shanghai. And it's believed that they will be safest there. So that's where they go. And 20,000 cases pile up in Shanghai in a disused hospital in the French concession. Ma Heng, who is now the director of the Palace Museum, decides that they're not going to be safe there in the long term. So he oversees the construction of a new storehouse, a permanent storehouse for them in the capital of the Chinese Republic, Nanjing, several hundred miles away inland. By the end of 1936, all 20,000 cases have been moved to Nanjing, where they are stored in modern, purpose-built warehouses. There's a bomb-proof vault, air conditioning, all the latest mod cons. Everybody hopes they'll be safe there. But in 1937, all-out war between China and Japan begins. After heavy fighting in Shanghai, the Japanese begin their advance through the mud and through the autumn rain inland from Shanghai towards Nanjing in late 1937. Nearly 20,000 cases of art remain in the Nanjing storehouse as the Japanese approach the walls of the city in November 1937. The Japanese army is nearly at the walls of the capital of the Republic of China, Nanjing. As the Japanese approach, the Palace Museum finds itself trying to evacuate 20,000 cases and has only a matter of a couple of weeks to do it. The museum commandeers trucks, hires hundreds of porters, takes over locomotives and rolling stock, hires steamships on the Yangtze River in order to try and get the imperial collections out of Nanjing to safety. In late November 1937, porters load 20,000 cases aboard trains and steamers day and night. Japanese bombers are pounding the city. The city is burning. The docks are overwhelmed with refugees. It's a truly awful moment. But the curators, the Palace Museum curators, managed to get 17,000 cases containing the imperial art collections out of Nanjing. 3,000 don't make it, they get left behind. The last cases leave Nanjing just 10 days before the Japanese take the city, with all that was to follow, the terrible massacres that followed, often referred to as the Rape of Nanjing, one of the most brutal events of the entire war in Asia. And now this extraordinary journey really gets underway. These 20,000 cases travel to the far west of China, and they follow an absolutely enormous migration of people, one of the largest migrations in modern history. About 100 million Chinese people flee the Japanese advance in the west of China. They flee, in the east of China, and they flee to the far west of China. The government of the Republic flees from Nanjing to the far west of China, to Chongqing. Factories, universities, schools, everybody flees the Japanese and relocates to the far west. It's an absolutely extraordinary migration before the Japanese advance. And the movement of these 20,000 cases of art is part of that larger migration. The first tranche of cases, a very small, just 80 cases, just a very small group of cases containing some of the rarest pieces in the collection, move from Nanjing up the Yangtze River by steamship. Then they go south by truck, far, far, far south, up into Guizhou province, to a little place called Anshun, out there in the mountains in far southwest China. Here, Ma Heng has found a cave which is deep enough and dry enough to store some of the finest pieces of the imperial collections. It takes them 18 months to make that journey. And here in Anshun, these cases will stay for the next 6 years under the watchful eye of a curator named Zhuang Yan and his family. The second group of cases takes what's called the central route. They go by steamship the whole way up the Yangtze River to Yichang, onto the wartime capital of China, Chongqing. Above Chongqing, the Yangtze River is extremely hard to navigate. It's full of rocks and sandbars and deep, deep gorges, and the water moves incredibly violently and quickly. So they have to shift all these cases onto very, very small boats to get them all the way up this turbulent part of the river. And then they go up this other river here, the Min River, again by small steamer. And at the end of this journey, they're actually going on bamboo rafts, cases piled on bamboo rafts, hauled from the bank by squads of men, hauling ropes, hauling these rafts laden with the imperial collections upstream. And they end up at a place just outside Leshan, a little tiny village called Angu, where the cases will be stored in temples and old ancestral halls in quiet villages just outside Leshan here. And here they'll stay for 7 years under the eyes of a curator called Na Zhiliang. The third, that was about 9,000 cases that made its way to Leshan. The third group of cases, about 7,500 of them, go by rail north to Suzhou on trains, and then far, far, far west out to Baoji, where the railway line runs out and there's nowhere else for the cases to go. And the Japanese are advancing along this very railway line. Over the course of about 18 months, it's decided that these cases must move further, further south, always further into the west of China, away from the advancing Japanese. So they go by truck from Baoji south over the Qinling Mountains, which is the highest mountain range in China outside Tibetan Xinjiang. It goes up to 12,000 feet, and they have to move in winter. This is the worst part, probably, of the entire journey. Trucks driving up switchbacks, hairpin bends in whiteouts, in snow. Trucks are overturning. Trucks are getting lost. People are getting stranded in the snow. There's no food. It's an appalling journey. And from here on further south, from Hanzhong down into the far west of China, the cases continue over months and months and months into 1939. And all the bridges are out. They've all been bombed by the Japanese. And as the trucks come down on this stage of the journey, they have to drive onto, every time they come to a river, they have to drive onto these bamboo rafts. These are trucks of the Palace Museum laden with cases. And these bamboo rafts get pulled across the rivers by boatmen, pushing them, poling them with bamboo poles across the rivers. And apart from the dangers involved of a raft overturning and the truck sinking, it's just incredibly slow. It takes nearly 2 years for these 7,000 cases to go from Nanjing by train and by truck the whole way down to Ermei, where they stay in this little town, this little ramshackle town, Ermei, stored in empty temples, temple buildings, for the next 7 years. And during this period, during this extraordinary journey, an awful lot happens. It's crisis after crisis, improvisation after improvisation. And I get into some detail in the book about how many of these episodes are almost result in disaster, how complex and demanding and draining and terrifying the whole voyage was for the curators involved. Japanese bombing was everywhere. There was very little food. There was very little transport. The curators are fighting wherever they look to book space on steamships or find trucks or find gasoline or any means of actually moving the cases. Venal steamship owners and corrupt military officers, war profiteers, scammers, con artists. Our curators have to deal with all of these all of the time. And the one constant for the curators throughout, as they're trying to move these 20,000 cases to safety, is fear. Not just fear of a violent death, but fear of failure. Fear that these cases will get smashed, lost, stolen, that the art inside will get broken, will get soaked with water, will be ruined. They fear failure and they fear shame and disgrace. By the end of 1939, the cases are as safe as the Palace Museum can hope to have them. They're down here in Anshun, they're here in Leshan, here in Ermei. Ma Heng himself manages the entire effort at the Palace Museum from the city of Chongqing, here, the wartime capital of the Republic of China, where he endured the terrible bombing by Japanese aircraft year after year. Ma Heng's wife, his very wealthy wife, has stayed behind in Shanghai. She didn't go with him. And he never sees her again. She dies in 1940. Out here in the far west of China, where the cases are stored, the conservation effort to keep them safe is underway. The curators work day and night protecting this incredibly fragile art from damp, from rain, from termites, from bugs, from moths, things that can burrow into the wooden cases and just eat away at them. And they have to protect them from fire as well. Enormous precautions taken against fire every day, every night. These curators are down on their hands and knees, crawling between these great stacks of cases, looking for termites, looking for moths. They're patrolling the cases against fire. And it goes on year and year after year after year. They have to open the cases up and take out the most fragile books and texts and paintings and works of calligraphy to air them, to dry them out, to make sure they're not going moldy. The conservation is a huge, huge effort, month after month, year after year. And a very important point about this time is the way that Ma Heng, as he tries to manage this entire effort, is losing control of his finances. The central government is funding this whole thing, but it's never enough. Ma Heng is always short of money. And worse than that, the Republic of China falls victim to absolutely appalling inflation at this point. And you get a real insight into why the Republic of China begins to fall apart in the early mid-1940s because of runaway inflation. Ma Heng tells us in his writings, in his reports, that the cost of the oil that they use in their lamps to light the storage halls has gone up by a factor of 40 times in under 2 years. Stationery has risen, pen and paper has gone up by a factor of 10 times. Food is going up between 10 and 20 times. Everybody who's working on this effort is reduced to absolute penury because they're on fixed salaries, and inflation is eating away at everything. And we get a real insight from this story at the role that inflation played in the collapse of the Republic of China and the eventual victory of the Communist Party. Fast forward to 1945, Japan surrenders. World War II is over in some sense. And the last chapter of this story begins. Now, all these 20,000 cases have to make their way back, the whole way back to Eastern China. And over 2 years, they do so, from 1945 to 1947. They go by naval craft the whole way up the Yangtze River, 20,000 cases back to Nanjing. But as this effort takes place, China is falling back into civil war between the Republic of China, headed by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, headed by Chairman Mao. The communists are on the move. They've spent the wartime years organizing, getting stronger, and now they're taking over all of North China. The Republic begins to collapse. In 1948, the government of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek orders a retreat to the island of Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek orders that his government, what's left of his military, and the entire gold bullion reserve of China shall all retreat to Taiwan, this island off the coast of China. Chiang Kai-shek also orders that as part of his retreat, he will take with him the most important art from the imperial collections. The Palace Museum curators are ordered to begin selecting the very finest pieces for evacuation to Taiwan. And in early 1949, a landing ship like this one begins loading cases filled with the very finest pieces of Chinese art. And it takes them off to Taiwan. 3 shipments of the imperial collections, about 3,000 cases in all, leave for Taiwan. 20,000 pieces of porcelain went to Taiwan, hundreds of the most important paintings of the imperial collections, 150,000 volumes of rare books, thousands of works in bronze and jade, all went to Taiwan, where they remain today in the Palace Museum in Taipei. The imperial collections, China's imperial collections, once held in the Forbidden City, the property of emperors, are now split. They are irrevocably divided between Peking and Taiwan, and they remain so today. Here are the cases after they arrived in Taiwan, those 3 cases of the most valuable art that arrived in Taiwan. This is what they looked like, and you can see the labels on them. If you look at these labels, you get a sense of the incredibly complicated and very rigorous labeling and cataloging system that the curators used throughout this extraordinary journey to keep track of where every case, every piece was at every stage in the journey. The record keeping was absolutely meticulous. And that, I think, is how we are very confident that none of this art, through 16 years of moving all through China, all through World War II, none of this art got lost. Some of it got broken, but none of it got lost. And this labeling system and the cataloging system is sort of how we know that. The last chapter in my book deals with the fate of Ma Heng himself. He never went to Taiwan. He elected to stay on the mainland and wait for the communist takeover. He stayed in the Forbidden City. And how he fared under the new communist regime when the Chinese Communist Party and Chairman Mao came to power in 1949 is not a very it's not a great story. It's a sad story. Many intellectuals were persecuted under Chairman Mao, in the early years of the People's Republic of China, under the communist regime, and Ma Heng was one of them. Even as an old man, somebody who had given his entire life to preserving the imperial art collections, he was treated very badly, and we can talk more about that if you want. So in its larger context, this is a story about the art of China, and it's a story about the people who saw these imperial art collections on this extraordinary journey. And it's a story about China's World War II, this really huge, epic war. World War II took place in China on a monstrous scale. Something between 14 and 20 million people died in China during World War II. But it's not something that the historiography of World War II in the United States really deals with very much. It's not something we understand well. We don't see it represented in museums or literature or art or movies or anything else. We've sort of forgotten about it. So this is a story about China's Second World War as well. And it's also a story about nationhood and a way that a generation of Chinese people tried to engender a sense of nation through fostering a sense of national culture and shared national history through these art objects, through art. And I'll leave it there and I'll wrap it up, and we can go to questions if anybody wants to pick up on any part of that.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's so interesting. And again, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. We'll get to it. And that was just scratching the surface of what's in the full book. So if that intrigued you at all, I do encourage you to pick up the book. Going back to the beginning of the story that you talk about, just this incredible effort. You know, Atlanta History Centers and museums, so I'm pretty familiar with what goes into cataloging and making these things happen. And the curators that oversaw this process were just, I mean, incredibly talented. The amount of work that they were able to do, their meticulousness, their skill was just incredible. So can you talk a little more about how those curators found their way into this project? And one of our audience questions deals with that. They wanted to know, you spoke about how some of the treasures in the palace were starting to walk away a little bit before the last kind of figurehead emperor was ultimately deposed. So how did they go about making sure that once this process started, that stealing and that looting didn't happen anymore?
Right. So during the last days of the Qing Empire, as the empire was collapsing, as the ruling dynasty was coming to an end, one of the ways that they kept financing the court was actually to sometimes sell off art from the imperial collections. The demand in Japan and Europe and the United States was strong. People were paying big money. And sometimes they would mortgage it too. They would mortgage it to banks against as collateral against loans. So, and some of it was just plain old getting stolen. Palace servants, even members of the royal family themselves, were sort of shoveling stuff up their sleeves and walking out of the palace at the end of the day and taking it to the antiques markets in Peking, around the famous antiques markets of Liulichang, which were well known as places among European and American collectors to come and pick up bargains. And if it was an imperial piece of art, it was particularly valued. And the same is true today on the international art market. If you can show that a piece of Chinese art has imperial provenance, that it was ever in the imperial collections, it's worth way, way more than any other piece of art. So the curators themselves, there is a long tradition in China of the study of objects and painting. So the scholarship surrounding art and the ability to recognize it, define it, contextualize it, conserve it, is very, very deeply established over more than 1,000 years in China. So the antiquarian tradition of scholarship is very, very strong. So these curators at the time, these art historians, archaeologists, these guys in the museums of China at the time are deeply steeped in the ability to recognize and know what they're looking at and understand what they're seeing. And that's who these guys were. But perhaps the most interesting thing about this moment from about 1915 on through the 1920s is China's engaged in this colossal effort at modernization, a huge intellectual, emotional, psychological transition where they're sucking in all this expertise from the rest of the world in politics, philosophy, archaeology, art history, you name it. And they're developing all their curatorial techniques based on stuff that they're learning from from Europe and the United States. So they're bringing to bear not only this Chinese tradition, but they're bringing to bear all this new knowledge that's flooding into China from Europe and the States and Japan as well. So these guys are in a complete crucible of learning and understanding, and they're sort of making it up as they go along. They're designing an understanding of this huge, they're seeing the collections for the first time, and they're sort of designing their own response to it at the same time. So it is an extraordinary moment, and they were extraordinary people.
I wonder, so you mentioned a couple of times that this collection was it was assembled by the Central Powers in China at that time. It was meant to be a private collection for the imperial family. And so this, this coming to light of this collection in the 1920s was the first time that the people of China were actually getting to see these really crucial parts of their national heritage and their national history. But it also struck me as I was reading that throughout this journey, it's incredibly expensive, right? During wartime to do this work, it's really difficult. There's even descriptions of sometimes there are boats waiting and they say, refugees get off, we got to get these cases on, right? So there's this tension. And I wonder, in such a young republic, was there any resistance to people seeing these collections the same way that maybe the national government was seeing, or was there a widespread consensus across China that this art and this cultural heritage was something that they should prioritize during a time of really intense bombing and war?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. It's a hard one to answer. China was very, very fragmented at the time. So at times the curators were encountering people who understood completely what had to happen. And yes, of course, we must rescue this art in these cases. This was an effort. This whole migration to the west of China was an effort, I think, by the Republic of China to keep alive the idea of an independent, sovereign China. Remember, the Republic of China was the only state in all of East Asia that continued to resist Japan. The British Empire collapsed, the Dutch Empire collapsed, French Indochina collapsed, everywhere fell before the Japanese. The Japanese were running wild in 1941-42. And the Republic of China was the only nation state that continued to fight, that continued to resist them. And So keeping alive this idea of an independent China was very important to the government. And there were many in China who understood this. And you can read in the writing, the literature, the storytelling of the time, you can see how people understood that idea. But at the same time, it was so chaotic. And, you had curators, for example, who were loading cases onto steamships. And once they'd all been loaded up, the steamship owners would be demanding more money. They were war profiteering. There where they just got to places where the military just said, I'm sorry, no, there's no trucks available. We're trying to fight a war here. What do you mean moving these cases of art around? We're trying to survive. We need to move troops and ammunition. So they were in constant tension with their circumstances. But the central government under Chiang Kai-shek, and for the most part the military, I think, always understood the imperative and the value of moving this art as part of this larger idea of preserving the idea of an independent China and its cultural uniqueness. Yeah.
Sarah asks a good question. So you obviously deal with these many, many thousands of cases that make hundreds of miles of a journey across China. But there were, as you mentioned, some artifacts that were left behind in Peking, and then some that were left behind in Nanjing when the massive evacuation had to happen. So can you speak really quickly to what happened to all of that? Was that able to be preserved? Was any of it lost?
Great question. So a lot of stuff remains behind in Peking. And they crate it up and they do their best just to hide it and keep it safe from air raid. The Japanese come storming into the Forbidden City. They take a whole load of stuff, but not the most valuable art, interestingly. They take metal for to melt down for the war effort. They take a load of maps. They destroy anything that they think is subversive to Japanese interests. So like a lot of journals and books they burned. But they didn't plunder the art. And we think the reason for that, we don't really know why, but the best supposition we have is that the Japanese envisaged occupying all of China and of installing a new puppet emperor in the Forbidden City to rule as a Japanese puppet over all of a Japanese-controlled China. And they wanted the Forbidden City as a symbol of rule. So they didn't want to destroy it and they didn't want to wreck everything in it. In addition, the most important stuff had all gone. So the most important stuff wasn't there for them to steal. The stuff in Nanjing, about 2,500 cases got left behind in Nanjing. And it got opened up and messed around, and records are very sketchy. But most of it seems to have been recovered after the war. A lot of it doesn't seem to have left Nanjing. So it was more or less held intact. This whole story is sort of about getting away with it, about narrow escapes every single step of the way. And the fact that the imperial collection survived not just the journey to Western China, but also more or less survived what happened to them in Peking and Nanjing as well. It's just another example of the extraordinary luck involved in the whole story.
Yeah, even when there's great skill involved, we can all use some luck as well, right? And it really...
And vast amounts of art and huge numbers of libraries were destroyed elsewhere in China. Mm-hmm. There were 4,000 libraries in China before World War II. By the end of World War II, there were 900 left. That's the scale of the devastation we're talking about. So huge amounts of art, vast numbers of texts were lost. It just wasn't the imperial collections.
Yeah, it's just incredible. Andrea says, thank you for a wonderful telling of this story. And she thought it was so interesting because, like you said, sheds light on the history of China and not just the art. She wants to know, is the art still available to be viewed for Chinese citizens today?
Yes, it absolutely is. So the Palace Museum Beijing is back in Beijing. It's in the Forbidden City in Beijing. If you travel to China and you walk through Tiananmen, the great gate at the top of Tiananmen Square, and you walk through the Meridian Gate that I showed you at the start there, you'll find yourself in the museum, and there it is. You can see it, and they have displays, and it's a museum. Equally in Taiwan, the cases that went to Taiwan, the art that went to Taiwan now forms the core of the wonderful Palace Museum Taipei. So yes, you can get on the subway and ride up to northern Taipei and go to the Palace Museum Taipei and see some of the rarest, finest treasures of the imperial collections, including those two paintings I showed you, Early Snow on the River and Deer in an Autumn Grove, and that ewer with the very rare copper red glaze. They're all in Taipei, and from time to time they're on exhibition. So yes, you can see all of it.
It's really makes you appreciate how old Chinese civilization is. In the US, we don't have many equivalents to that. So to those in the audience, thank you for your great questions. Please keep submitting them. We have a few more minutes. Donald wants to know, and it's a great question, if you could talk a bit about your research. And I'm going to add on to that. How did you first come to this story, and how did you get your feet wet into this whole experience?
So my background, some of my career was spent kind of reporting from China and paying attention to China in general. And I studied Chinese at university, so I speak and read the language to some extent. I first heard about the story. It was actually my wife was in Taiwan and was in the museum in Taiwan, in the Palace Museum, and heard one of the docents talking about this story. And she's no slouch on 20th century Chinese history. And she'd never heard it before. And she came back to Washington, D.C., where we live, and asked me if I'd ever heard about it. And I hadn't either. And we quite literally sat down and Googled it. And we found that there was no full telling of this story in English. There was one or two academic articles, and there was one chapter in one book taking a stab at it. But there was no, and the more I looked into it, the more I found that there was primary source material getting published in Chinese in China. So there was a whole load of material surfacing that had never made its way into English at all. So I just thought, well, it sort of felt like a story was falling into my lap and nobody else had done it. So as a kind of jobbing journalist and commercial writer, I thought it would be good to give it a go. And so I spent a lot of time fighting through the primary source material. I hired a researcher in China to help me find primary source material, and we took it from there. Yeah.
Judy is asking about there is an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Chinese, the years of the Chinese empires ended just after 1900. So were those artifacts from the collection of the Forbidden City, and how often do the imperial collections go on display outside of China? And I don't know, also, if you want to talk a little bit about, in the book, you talk about a couple instances, even before the war and during the war, when some of these collections made their way outside of China on display as well.
I'm not familiar with the New York exhibit. I'm not sure. It is common for the Beijing Palace Museum to lend stuff. Yes, absolutely. They're very big on lending stuff. There's a huge a huge exhibition about to take place in London this coming year. And Taipei does too. So yes, this stuff makes its way all over the world. There was a fabulous exhibition at the Free Air here in DC a couple of years ago. And even as all this story was taking place and the cases were on the move during World War II, yes, they attempted to keep functioning as a museum, and they actually packed up 1,000 pieces into special cases and took them the whole way to London in 1935-36 for an enormous exhibition of Chinese art in London at that time. And that exhibition, in fact, kind of kick-started the study of Chinese art in Europe. It wasn't taken very seriously before then, but that exhibition was an enormous catalyst for people paying attention to the art of China. And they even did one as well to Moscow. They sent pieces to Moscow in 1939. It was in Moscow on exhibition when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. And there are all these extra sort of angles to the story that I deal with in the book that are really quite extraordinary, where you feel the sort of intersection of art and curatorship and conservation and just outright war, global war. And people are constantly having to make seat of the pants decisions about what they do next. Yeah.
when you described that exhibit in Moscow and you say, okay, so it was leaving Moscow and going to Leningrad. It's like, no, anywhere,
Yes, I do know
anywhere but
Leningrad.
that.
Right.
But again, like somebody by
Yeah.
some extraordinary measure, it all makes it back. Well, we have a couple more audience questions here. Again, if you're listening and you have something you haven't asked yet and you're dying to ask Adam, he's here now. Now's the time. Go ahead and submit that to the Q&A. The first is from Elizabeth. She says it's easy to see the parallels and themes of this true story and your fiction writing. But how did you find yourself researching and writing this book, which I know you've addressed a little bit before, but I'd be particularly interested in your approach to nonfiction versus fiction. And she finishes off by saying, everyone drinks if the pandemic lockdown gets mentioned.
Yeah, it was. So I wrote 3 novels before I wrote commercial novels. Before I wrote this. On some level, I've been a journalist for a long time, so I was sort of used to dealing with source material and writing what I hope was nonfiction at the time as a journalist. There are useful tricks in fiction writing, and when you write 3 novels and you get edited by really talented editors, they help you learn to build narrative and how to keep narrative moving and how to lean forward. And so fiction writing certainly helps me anyway, with the construction of narrative. And when I came to writing this book, which is history, sure, but I think of it more as narrative nonfiction. I'm not a historian. I'm a commercial writer. So I was certainly, I think, building on fiction writing, the ability to try and draw out character, the attempt to build voice, thinking about point of view, thinking about how characters change, how they evolve, looking for those opportunities to push that stuff into the writing of narrative nonfiction. Yeah, it was helpful, but it's obviously a very different thing. When you're writing nonfiction, you're writing to an external referent, and what you write has to be at least somewhat true. It's got to be provable. If you did the same research as me, you would have to find the same thing as I found. So that obviously was an enormous difference, and it's it's a learning process.
Absolutely. Christine wants to know if there's a mini series under consideration similar to the Monument Men or
That
anything
would be
else.
nice. That would be nice. If you have any contacts, do let them know. It's a very difficult story to do for the screen, obviously, because you would have to recreate the Second World War in China. Unfortunately, not much gets made today without investment from China, because China is the biggest box office in the world, right? So this book is unfortunately not acceptable to the censors in the People's Republic of China right now for various reasons. So I would love to think that someone might buy the broadcast rights, but it hasn't happened yet, and I wouldn't hold out too much hope, to be realistic.
Yeah. Well, you never know who's in the audience, so
Yeah.
we'll see. And Andrea asked a really good question. Thank you for asking this, because you get into it in the book. She asked, was there a risk that the anti-intellectual aspect of the Cultural Revolution, so after the war, would harm or destroy this art? Why was it spared? I thought that it was so interesting. The art was spared, aspects of this kind of imperial structures in the Forbidden City were spared. Kind of runs in the face of how sometimes the communist parties understood in China. Why did they see value in this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the art survives all the way through the beginning of the People's Republic. Decision is taken at high level in the Chinese Communist Party that this kind of the grand sweep of Chinese history and Chinese civilization is going to be sort of a theme for them. And the guy who was really behind this was the prime minister. It wasn't Chairman Mao himself, it was the prime minister, Zhou Enlai. And as we know, in the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s, when the Cultural Revolution gets underway, vast amounts of stuff gets smashed up. There are campaigns against the three olds. There are campaigns against Confucianism. Temples get burned down. Museums get wrecked. Everything gets bust up. But again, the Forbidden City survives and the imperial collections survive. And we think our best take is that the Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, ordered that the Forbidden City be protected. And he posted the military around the Forbidden City in the 1960s so that the radicals, the Red Guards, could not get in and smash everything up. And while, huge amounts of stuff got destroyed, once again, the imperial collections got away with it. I don't go into that in the book. I stop in 1955. But this whole story is about a series of extraordinary narrow escapes that the imperial collections went through. And indeed, the Cultural Revolution was yet another one.
And yeah, the extraordinary escapes continue throughout the 20th century. Well, we're coming up towards the end of our time this evening. So I just want to ask one final question in closing. And it's, this story, you dig into the art, you dig into World War II history in China, but you also, as you said at the beginning, it's a story of people. And you talk specifically about Ma Heng tonight, but there are several other curators who we follow who become very familiar and follow their families all throughout this story. So I didn't know if you wanted to end tonight by just talking a little bit more about why you chose to follow the people in this story and not just the art.
I feel quite strongly that we in the United States are not, and Europe and much of the world, we're not very kind of China competent, right? We know very little about Chinese history. It's very, most people in America, we find it very difficult even to name kind of Chinese people, right? We know about Chairman Mao, we know about a few other people. We know about Xi Jinping, the current president. Maybe we know about Ai Weiwei, the famous sculptor, whatever. But broadly, our sense of the kind of cultural and historical landscape of China is pretty scanty. It's pretty thin. And I think that the way to get around that, when we're writing history, when we're trying to get like handholds and footholds on what this thing we call China is, what do we talk about when we talk about China? Who are these guys? Where did the Chinese Communist Party come from? Why do they think the things they do, say the things they say? What stories do they tell themselves about themselves? As we try to wrestle with this enormous entity that we call China, a really good way of getting some of those handholds and those footholds, and of getting ourselves to engage, is telling personal stories. It's getting to know people. It's like the one historian wrote, if you people history with people, it becomes a lot easier to engage with and understand. So part of my aim in the book is to try and bring you close to a couple of people and they wrote memoirs, right? So we have their voices, and I try to draw out their voices and their lived lives and their lived experience so that you can begin to feel, I hope, a little bit what it was like to be alive in that time. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Adam. And thank you for a wonderful presentation and deeply engaging book. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you for turning out. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. And I wrote this in the chat, but I promise, we got through a lot tonight, but we really only scratched the surface of it. So if you're intrigued by tonight's conversation, there's a link in the chat to get the book. If you're looking for more events, if you're in the Atlanta area, we have a lot going on in person. We also have another virtual talk coming up in April. You can find all of that at atlantahistorycenter.com, and the link to the Author Talks page is in the chat as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you again to Adam, and we hope to see you all again very soon.